Hey, welcome back to the drum workshop. I'm Luke, and what the f*** is this? Of course, it's one of those hybrid percussion triggers made by WTF Percussion in Sweden. Axel from WTF very kindly gave me some of these triggers to try out quite some time ago, sorry about that, along with a couple of other very interesting hybrid percussion instruments that I won't be covering today. So these are review units that I'm able to keep hold of, but all views in this video are based on my own experience with the triggers, and that's because I'm supported by you through my store over at theedrumworkshop.com, so I can remain completely independent. What I really like about these triggers is that they're incredibly simple. They're like drum triggers, but for percussion, and that opens up some flexible creative options which I'll get into later. They're available for jam blocks and tambourines, and each trigger has been specifically tailored to mount directly to particular instruments in an unobtrusive way using available mounting holes or screws. For example, this trigger has been designed for Meinl jam blocks, and it's been made to fit two different designs. So it mounts like this on the high-pitch jam block that I have, whereas it would mount like this on the low-pitch block. This trigger has been made for Latin percussion jam blocks, so it mounts like this. And finally, I was also given this trigger for Meinl tambourines, which needs to be attached by removing one of the screws on the tambourine's mount. There is another one available for LP tambourines as well. So you need to keep this in mind when you're ordering, and each product page will tell you which models that trigger is compatible with. Design-wise, I think they look great and they are well thought out, though there are a couple of small issues that I ran into. The first is from the use of these small thumb screws for fixing the jam block triggers into place. I understand why they're used, they're low profile so they don't stick out too far, and they do need to fit into the small spaces available for mounting. However, I found them a little bit awkward to use, and I wasn't able to get them tightened enough. They seemed secure to begin with, but after playing for a little while they'd loosen up, which is a problem for both mounting and triggering. I was eventually able to tighten up the Meinl one with a spanner that didn't technically fit, but it did do the job, and that one hasn't moved since. The Latin percussion one, though, does keep coming loose over time. I wonder whether maybe a wing screw might be better in some cases. On the Meinl jam block, it would definitely fit in fine with the one that's already used for mounting. I'm not certain though whether it would fit on the LP trigger, so that might not be the perfect solution, but maybe the option might be handy. I also ran into an issue when installing the Meinl tambourine trigger. The screw that came on the tambourine had been cut at the factory to be flush, so the additional depth of the trigger meant that there was no length left on the screw to secure it. I asked Axel about this, and fortunately he was aware and he'd already solved it by the time I got round to reviewing. Apparently some batches have longer screws and some are cut down, so now he provides an additional screw with the trigger just to make sure all bases are covered. I bought my own screw to save time, attached it, and now it works as intended. Perfect. I also wonder exactly how durable they'll be over time on the road, being plastic. Fortunately though, they have been designed to stay far away from the strike zone of the instruments that they're attached to, so I imagine that they will hold up as long as you look after them. Now, do the triggers work exactly as they should? So I've only demonstrated these on my SPD-SX Pro because they perform practically identically on every module that I've tried them on, and that performance is very good. They're only single zone triggers, so unlike a lot of the triggers that I test, there are no weird compatibility issues or quirks across different modules that handle multiple zones differently. If the module can pick up a trigger signal, then these will probably work. They do have quite a low output signal compared to a lot of the triggers that I test, but that's not necessarily a negative. All I needed to do was increase the sensitivity or the input gain on each module, and the signal was never so low that they couldn't be used on any of the modules that I own. And it might actually be advantageous on Yamaha modules too, since they typically prefer lower signals than, say, Roland modules, but unfortunately I don't own any to confirm that. Whether or not you'll need to adjust anything else will just depend on the module or trigger unit that you're using and how you're using them. This setup is a little bit unconventional for the sake of testing, but the only trigger behaviour that I ran into was pretty typical of triggering acoustic instruments. I initially set up the jam blocks on the same L rod, which increased the crosstalk and false triggering as I expected. I could dial all of that out with a combination of crosstalk cancellation and higher thresholds, it was all controllable, but separating them onto different L rods even when they're on the same stand meant that I could scale all of those settings back much more, which is definitely preferable. For the tambourine, there was one other thing to overcome, and that's unintentional re-triggers. This is due to the nature of tambourines, really. They jingle about when you hit them, so you need to account for that when you're setting up the triggers. Other instruments or stage noise could also make them vibrate sympathetically, which you could just as easily run into triggering any acoustic drum. Setting the threshold a bit higher stopped the trigger from firing from any small vibrations, and then I used the mask time or re-trigger settings available on each module to dial out any of the double hits from the zills shaking after my initial strike. This does mean that very light taps won't trigger, but this isn't like an electronic snare drum that needs to pick up soft, fast rolls, so the performance is more than good enough for the real-world applications. Since they're single zone, there's also the potential to use two of them in one input, but that does depend on the module that you're going into. Some will allow you to split an input with a simple Y cable, like Yamaha modules and their DTX-Multi 12 pad, the Pearl Mimic Pro, eDrum In, 2-box modules, some Alesis modules and their Strike Multipad, or the Roland SPD-S, SX or SX Pro, TM2 and TM6 Pro. However, most Roland V-drum modules don't let you split pads with standard Y-splitters. They need a specific splitter cable with a resistor built in, and I think this also applies for F-Note modules as well. For anything else, check the manual or the trigger settings to see if it's possible. Once again though, this isn't a limitation of the triggers themselves, it's just something to keep in mind. So the loosening triggers aside, I really like these from a design and performance standpoint, but let's talk about their creative potential. I think they unlock some great options for players who use percussion in their setup, but they want either a larger range of sounds or more control. So let's start simple. You can use them to add a layered sound on your percussion. Or you can reinforce your live percussion with a sample of the same instrument, giving you a nice clean percussion hit. And that might sound a little bit odd, but it's actually a very practical use. Sometimes percussion can struggle to be heard in a live setting, especially if it's been added onto an acoustic drum kit. All the drums are often close mic'd, but the percussion might not be. Sometimes it might not be close enough to the other mics, so it could get lost in the mix, or if you do mic it up, then it's an extra microphone to try and fit into your setup. Instruments like tambourines are also quite quiet relative to the rest of the instruments, so that additional mic might just be picking up a bunch of bleed from everything else. Using a trigger will give you an isolated sample with no bleed that can be mixed in at whatever level it needs to be. And as with any triggered sound, it can be a perfectly produced sample that's consistent from gig to gig. The bonus is that you're not triggering it from a pad, so you still get all of the acoustic sound and feel of the instrument either in the room or on stage. If you would rather mic up the source sound though, the trigger can be used as a gate on the microphone. So when the triggered instrument is hit, the gate will open, and that lets the signal from the microphone through. Then, after a certain amount of time, the gate closes and the signal of that microphone won't come through. As a result, you get a close mic'd percussion with minimal bleed. You can also use the trigger to add effects to your percussion. So there I just used a sample of the same instrument and then added the effect to that sample. Depending on the unit that's doing the triggering though, there's all kinds of scope for different effects that you can control, rather than leaving it up to the front of house engineer who may or may not be familiar with what you want. And these are just a few different things that I can think of or that I know about. I'm sure that there are other potential uses too. Price-wise, these aren't the cheapest single zone triggers. They're all priced at €59, which converts to roughly $69 or £51 in the UK at the time of writing. Shipping was showing up as €15 for me, so another $18 or £13. However, it's really hard to compare these to other single zone triggers because most of those are for drums, whereas these are for percussion. There aren't really any other options. These are also being made by a small company and they've designed them well to fit in with the percussion that they're attaching to, so I think they're worth the asking price if you want what they do. Otherwise, the only other downside of these triggers is that of course they're not going to be for everyone. They're very much a hybrid trigger rather than fully electronic, so any E-drummers looking for cool percussion-shaped add-ons for their quiet home practice will be out of luck here. These don't affect the acoustic sound by design, so of course the instruments remain loud. If you do want to trigger your percussion though, these are a unique and very solid option. So what the f*** are you waiting for?